Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and in this episode, we are joined by our guest, Ben Sandford. Listeners, Ben competed as an elite athlete in skeleton racing for New Zealand. He is a 3-time Olympian, and he received the bronze medal at the 2012 Bobsleigh and Skeleton World Championships. Since wrapping up his athletic career in 2014, he has taken on a different kind of challenge by becoming chair of the World Anti-Doping Agency's Athlete Committee. He is also a member of the New Zealand Olympic Committee Athlete Commission and an attorney with Sandford Partners. And listeners, Ben is joining us today to discuss his experiences and, of course, WADA's efforts to integrate the athlete voice. So, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Hi, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and doing very well, coming to you from Rotorua in New Zealand.
Oh, wonderful. We are excited to connect with you and excited to learn more from you today. So can you start by just telling us more about yourself, Ben, and your work with WADA?
Yeah, so I've been on WADA Athlete Committee now for 9 years. I was a committee member until the end of 2019, and then I became the chairperson of the Athlete Committee. And so it's a 3-year term as chairperson, so I'm about halfway through and finish up at the end of 22. And it's been an intriguing journey, both being on the committee over the last 9 years, but also being the chairperson and more recently being the chair during the pandemic that we had and the challenges that that's also created.
Certainly. So how did you adjust or adapt to leading this organization during the pandemic?
I think probably really similar to how everyone's adapted. We've all had to pivot and do things a bit differently and move from having in-person meetings to meetings online. There's a lot more webinars now. There's a lot more communication via digital platforms like Zoom. So getting really used to using all of those. And because I'm in New Zealand, it's not a very good time zone usually. So for me, it normally just means late nights or early mornings on calls with people that are in time zones where there are more people. So I'm usually on the short end of the stick there.
Understood. Well, you're coping with it quite well, and I appreciate you joining me early in the morning there in New Zealand. And I know beyond your experiences with WADA, you've had some really cool positions here. You've worked with the New Zealand Olympic Committee, and also you held a position with the International Bobsleigh and Skeleton Federation. So just to give our listeners some more background here, can you tell us more about those roles as well?
Yeah, so I started as an athlete competing in skeleton back in 2002. And before I got into skeleton, I'd been through university in New Zealand and I'd become qualified as a lawyer and then went overseas to actually play in the squash tournament. But my uncle had done skeleton before me, and so he got me involved in skeleton. So I picked up skeleton in 2002 and just fell in love with it absolutely and completely. And that's all I wanted to do from that day on, basically. And so just sort of dedicated everything in my life to doing skeleton after trying it for the first time in Austria. And as time went on, coming from what I would consider a small country in sliding sports, there's no facilities in New Zealand. You begin to realize that the rules that decision makers are making have a really big impact on you. So got quite involved in athlete representation within bobsleigh and skeleton. And so in 2006, I think it was, I was voted by the skeleton athletes to be their athlete representative. So that sort of was my first time being involved in an athlete commission and representing athletes. And there were a number of issues that we had at the time and things that we wanted to change to try and make things better for athletes and for athletes to have more voice within bobsleigh and skeleton. And as a result of that, got involved with the New Zealand Olympic Committee as well. So I think since 2008, I've been on the New Zealand Olympic Committee's Athlete Commission, and I'm also on their Integrity Commission now. So from being involved with bobsleigh and skeleton internationally, I think I was the skeleton athlete rep there for 8 years, from 2006 until 2014. And we made some really important changes in that time. So we got an athlete representative onto the executive committee of the IBSF. So that was initially me for the first year because there was a bit of a botch up in the elections. So I stepped in to fill that gap. So that got me involved in the executive committee within the IBSF. And then so once my career finished and I was no longer the skeleton athlete rep, I then ran for a position on the board as vice president of legal affairs. And I held that position for 4 years. So that was fascinating, sort of being on the other side, having been the athlete rep and then working on the executive committee as a normal vice president and looking after all the legal affairs, and under that also looking after or within what I was meant to be looking after, anti-doping as well. So yeah, it was interesting having different roles and being involved in that sort of international space and taking into account all the considerations that you have to do to try and make positive change and make things better for athletes and for the organisation as a whole.
Absolutely. And you mentioned you, of course, started your career as an athlete and then you started taking on more of these leadership roles. But I guess I'm curious, where does anti-doping fit in and how did you get interested in this subject?
A number of ways, actually. I'm a really, really big believer that if decisions are being made that affect athletes, then athletes should have a say in those decisions. And I think that makes for much better decision making, and it also gives legitimacy to those decisions. That was one of the things I felt very strongly about within bobsleigh and skeleton, was that athletes maybe at the beginning didn't have enough say, and they really needed to have a say because there were decisions being made that really affected them. And I think the more we got involved and the more we were able to contribute and the more the International Federation listened, the better our decision making as an organisation became. And within that space, representing athletes and trying to make those changes, learned about the WADA Athlete Committee and reached out to see if there was a vacancy there and ended up applying. I think the second time I applied, I was accepted onto the committee. And that really, it came about for the same reason. Like, I wasn't enormously affected myself by doping. There isn't, I would say, a lot of doping within skeleton, but I felt very strongly that if decisions were being made and if rules were being made that affected athletes, then we should have a seat at the table and we should have a say. And that makes those rules much better, much more considered, and it means that athletes are being heard within the process. Probably the only anti-doping or doping thing that really touched me at the time anyway during my career was there was a US athlete, Zach Lund, in 2005, 2006, and this was as I was going into my first Olympics, and he had been taking some medication. Him and his doctor hadn't spotted that had been put on the banned list, and then he tested positive and was essentially removed from the Olympic Village sort of the night before the start of the Olympics. I think was banned for 3 months, and then 6 months later this substance was taken off the banned list.
Oh, wow.
So it sort of struck me as being incredibly unfortunate that he hadn't picked up that the substance had been put on the banned list and then the substance get taken off the banned list the next year. So you're just trying to make sure that athletes have all the information that's out there, that everyone's aware of the risks, but also that we are the main stakeholder here. We need to be involved in the decisions because they impact us the most, and I've seen how much anti-doping impacts people, just day to day, the whereabouts that we have to fill in, the doping controls that we have to go through, the sanctions that are given or not given. It's an enormous amount that we ask from athletes, and in return, I think it's reasonable for athletes to ask for equity in decision making and a seat at the table.
Certainly, and you touched on this a little bit in your previous response, but this idea of sport as a global endeavor is huge and I think very important. But what made you decide then that you wanted to be a part of WADA specifically?
I think a lot of it, to me, comes back to fairness. I'm a big believer in fair sport and clean sport, sort of sanctity of the competition. The best person wins on the day, the person that's worked the hardest, and I think doping is a really big issue, and we have to do whatever we can to protect the integrity of sport. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that athletes have rights, that they know those rights, that they have a seat at the table, that they can contribute. And that makes the process legitimate. It means that there has to be consultation. I think rules which are dictated to people are inherently weak. It's much better if we involve people in the process of creating those rules and creating the processes around them. And I think we're starting to do that better in anti-doping, but anti-doping has created this enormous legal system, essentially, where we create rules for athletes and we create rules for the organisations and the people that test athletes. But overwhelmingly, it's the athletes that bear the brunt and the responsibilities in the system. So we need to make sure that the athletes are heard, that they have an effective way to work in the system, to voice any concerns, to be part of the decision making and contribute to the system as a whole, because athletes have the most at stake. They're the ones that want clean sport more than anyone. So we have to enable that.
Absolutely. This is their life. This is their career. So I think that is so important.
Absolutely. Like, they have the most in the game, the most to win or lose. Athletes love sport and they dedicate their life to achieving their goals. So the decisions that we make in anti-doping or the decisions that tribunals make along the way, that's enormous differences. Like there's a huge difference between receiving a medal on the podium immediately after the race to receiving the medal in the hallway 8 years later. And we ask a lot of athletes, and we need to make sure that they're part of the process, and it's just not people that are quite disconnected sometimes from them, sort of dictating to athletes what they think is best, because athletes have an enormous amount to offer. And we are doing this, hopefully, all for athletes to make sure that we have competitions that are fair and have integrity. So they need to be involved.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there who might not be very familiar with this athlete committee, can you talk a little bit about the committee and its role within the kind of broader organization of WADA?
So athlete committees, or commissions as they're sometimes called, are internal committees of that organisation. So the WADA Athlete Committee was set up by WADA to be the voice of athletes within WADA. So at the moment we are 12 athletes or former athletes, and we report to the executive committee and to the foundation board, and also are able to sit on a number of other working groups and standing committees within the organisation. But essentially we're an internal body, and that's what an athlete committee is. It's an internal committee of whatever organisation it's part of. So in the US, you have the US OPC Athlete Committee, and they're an internal body of the US OPC. Same in pretty much every national Olympic committee in the world has an athlete committee, and they're an internal body. The other way that athlete representation has is when you have player unions, which represent the players or the athletes, but they're not internal bodies of that sports organisation. But on this topic, I would say sort of my response is always different horses for courses. And the way athlete representation has been set up within WADA is that it's done by an athlete committee. So we have decreased our membership size in recent years. There was a governance review within WADA, and we went from having 17 members down to 12 members, which has created some issues for us. But there's also another governance review underway at the moment, and so hopefully we'll be able to expand again and have more members than the current 12 that we have at the moment.
Gotcha. Very interesting. Well, I know these members of the athlete committee have a very important role, but listeners might be wondering out there, how does one end up on this committee? Is it something you apply for? Are you nominated? How does that work?
Yeah, you apply for it at the moment. And this is another thing. We've had an ongoing athlete representation review within WADA, trying to reform the space and reform what the athlete committee within WADA looks like. So at the moment, you're nominated by a stakeholder. So that might be your national anti-doping organisation, it might be your NOC, it might be your international federation. So they'll nominate you, and then the president and the director general will consult with me as the chair of the committee on who they think should be on the committee. And then a recommendation will be made to the executive committee, and the executive committee will be the ultimate deciders of who is in the athlete committee. We're trying to reform that, so we're wanting to create elected members, but also appointed members. So that's an ongoing process. It's been ongoing for a number of years, but hopefully we resolve that puzzle later this year, and we can go to the executive committee with some recommendations about what we think the athlete committee should look like moving forward.
Excellent. And I mean, perhaps it's just me, but it seems like a daunting responsibility, Ben, to step up and be one of only 12 people who are kind of representing athletes from a wide variety of sports from all over the world. Was it daunting for you to step into this role?
Yeah, I think I had big shoes to fill. Becky Scott was the chairperson before me, and I think she did a wonderful job. And she's a person with incredible integrity, and I think she really sort of set the bar. So I'm trying to live up to her standards and follow in her footsteps, but also to focus on the things that are in front of us and the work that we need to do. And yeah, there's only 12 of us at the moment, and that I would say creates some issues around who we represent and how we do that, because there's just not very many of us. But at the end of the day, like, I've been on this committee for 9 years now. I was a member for quite a while before I became the chairperson, so I know the workings of WADA well. I know what the issues have been in the past and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I've seen a huge amount of change within the committee and outside the committee around anti-doping and around what the committee can and can't do. So I think I was in a reasonably good space to be able to take on this role. And also now that I'm in this role, to try and make positive change for athletes. And it's a difficult space to work in. We don't have a seat on the executive committee or the foundation board. So a lot of it is trying to convince people in those decision-making roles that what we're wanting and what we're saying is not just good for the athletes, but good for anti-doping, good for the organisation, and that we should be both listened to and that athletes should be prioritised in the decision-making process.
Definitely. And as the chair then of the WADA Athlete Committee, is there anything that you really want athletes who might be listening out there who you are representing to know about you or to know about the organization?
I think one thing, like in anti-doping, I always think about it as it's not a perfect system. It's a system that we have that we always need to try and make better. And like I see all the media and read as much of the commentary as I can, and it's not perfect. And we need to continue working on it and trying to make things better and trying to make things better for athletes. So I see often criticism about whether it's WADA or whether it's some of the rules or whether it's substances. And a lot of that is really legitimate and we need to listen to it. There's a saying, your biggest critic is your greatest asset. And I think the more we work in the space, the more we have to be open to change and to trying to improve things. And I would encourage athletes to reach out to us if you have concerns, if you see issues, because the more that we're aware of, the more that we are told that things aren't working or they aren't working in the best way possible, the more that we can try and help to make change. But if we're not aware of the issues or athletes' concerns, then, it's us operating in the dark and trying to make change, sort of trying to act before things become an issue. So please reach out to us. We want to be engaged with athletes. We want athletes to be part of this process and feel like they have a say. So please contact us.
Oh, wonderful. So Ben, how can current or maybe former athletes even connect or get more involved?
There's a number of ways. I think to contact us, probably the easiest way is just to email me or to contact me via social media. You can also contact us through the WADA website. But also there's a number of layers within anti-doping and we need to make sure that there's athlete representation at all of those layers. And so whether that's at your national anti-doping organisation, whether that's your international federation or major event organiser, talk to them, tell them what the issues are. By all means, include us in those discussions if you want to. But you also have athlete reps often within those organisations. So reach out to them. We can all contribute to trying to make this a better system, to make it a fairer system. And I think that's a duty placed on all of us.
Certainly. And for you, I guess, Ben, is there anything specifically that you really want to see the WADA Athlete Committee add to its responsibilities or become more engaged with?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of key things. I think for the WADA Athlete Committee, I'd like to see us have a seat on the WADA Exco and also on the foundation board. I think those are key things for us moving forward, that we have a seat at the table, that we have a seat amongst the decision makers and that we can contribute to the organisation and to anti-doping in that way. I think, I've said this already in this interview, that athletes are the key stakeholders, and I don't think it's good enough that we don't have a seat at that table as that organisation's committee of athlete representatives. So being part of that governance and decision making would be my first main point. Secondly, I think we need to have athletes and athlete representatives involved in all aspects of anti-doping and decision making, whether it's working groups or standing committees, whether it's governance or communications or education. WADA and anti-doping itself needs to have athletes at the heart of what it does. It needs to work with athletes. It needs to consult with athletes. It needs and genuinely consult. There's often a lot of rhetoric around being athlete-centered or working with athletes, but talking the talk is one thing, but we really need to walk the walk, and genuine consultation, genuine decision-making will lead to more trust in the system, will lead to more athlete confidence in the system, because athletes will have a belief that they can have a say and that they can impact decisions, and that leads to more transparency. It leads to better outcomes for anti-doping organisations and also for athletes as well. So being more athlete-centred on top of the governance and decision-making, and making sure that athlete-centred approach is actually really genuine, and that, in my case for WADA, that WADA and us are really actually walking the walk instead of just putting something on a piece of paper and saying that we're athlete-centred.
Absolutely. And I think related to some of these comments you just made, there's been widespread criticism, not just for WADA, but for anti-doping in sport in general, that they're not necessarily taking this athlete-centered mindset, or maybe the athlete voice isn't necessarily coming through or getting heard. So what can WADA and other organizations do to address this perception, or to address the problem that it's not being receptive to the athlete voice, that people aren't having an opportunity to be heard?
There's a number of things that WADA can do and that anti-doping organisations can do. I'll talk through some of these, but I think the outcome of this is that we will get a better system. We will get greater athlete satisfaction with the system because they have a say. Anti-doping organisations will be more effective because athletes will be involved. And athletes want clean sport. Anti-doping organisations want clean sport. So we sort of start all on the same page. We just have to all carry on working on the same page and I guess rowing in the same direction. The disconnect often happens where athletes feel like maybe the rules aren't being equally sort of distributed across the board. One rule applies to them and maybe a different rule applies to an organisation. So you get this sort of inequality in the system, which often isn't well explained or well reasoned. So moving forward, what WADA can do and what anti-doping organisations in general can do is make sure that they have athlete representation, make sure that they have athlete representatives involved in the governance of the organisation and the decision making. And like I've said, this has to be genuine. And the more equity we can give to athlete representatives in those organisations, and by that I mean equity sort of around the table and making sure that their voice is equal to other stakeholders' voice. I think that's probably been one of the issues in the past, is that concerns that have been raised by athletes might have been voted down or turned away and not really sufficiently explained why those decisions have been made, or not explained to the satisfaction of athletes anyway. From WADA's perspective, I think we need to do a much better job of communicating with athletes. We've had a tendency to talk down to athletes, and I don't think that's good enough, so we need to change the way we communicate. We need to engage with athletes and we need to make sure that we are acting on the issues that they bring forward. It's all very well for an organisation to say, we want to hear from athletes, but once we're hearing from athletes, we're not actually doing anything about the concerns that they're raising, then obviously athletes are going to have an issue with that. I have an issue with that. So we need to not just engage, but we need to genuinely engage and then show that follow through from what they're saying to what actions we're taking to what those outcomes are. And that in turn leads to more athletes seeing that this is a positive process and that they can have an impact. And so more athletes will want to get involved, because one of the things I've seen is that if athletes see that the organisation is listening to them, more and more athletes will want to get involved. The decisions will become better and better because more athletes are being involved and putting into the system, and athletes' trust in that system will increase. If that doesn't occur, athletes, they won't invest their time and they'll just turn around and say, hey, look, this is an organisation that's not listening and not caring about our concerns. So they'll just push away. There's a couple of sort of key things that we're trying to do within WADA at the moment that I think will hopefully have a positive impact for athletes. That piece around athlete representation I spoke about earlier, I think that's really key for us within WADA moving forward, to make sure that athletes can vote for their representatives on WADA, that the athletes that are appointed to the athlete committee are actually appointed by other athletes, and sort of show that there is that pathway for athletes to have their concerns heard at the highest level and have that voice and be able to vote on key things if that's ever necessary. The other project that I'm quite excited about that we're working on, which is very, very athlete focused, is we're trying to set up an athlete anti-doping ombudsman or ombudsperson. So with this role, it's independent. We want to, as it moves forward, we want to regionalise it. So you not just have one ombuds sitting in one place, but have a number of ombuds around the world that athletes can go to. They can get free advice. They can get information from this person. They know that this person isn't connected to an anti-doping organisation, so they don't have that concern that this information is going to be used against them or that they might be being pushed into a corner. One of the things that we see is that at the moment, anti-doping organisations are both the educator, they're also the main source of information for athletes, but then they're also the police and they're also the prosecution body. So we want athletes to feel like they can get information very easily, very freely, and that's frank and honest advice. And so having these ombuds, hopefully around the world, where athletes can go and be told what their rights are, be told if there are concerns, they can raise those concerns with the ombuds. I think that'll be a really athlete-focused improvement on the current system, and I think that could really change things. The fact that you have these independent ombuds out there that are there specifically to help athletes navigate anti-doping, and I think we can all agree that anti-doping has become quite complicated, and every sort of door you look behind in anti-doping is another matrix of information and acronyms and research that you have to understand, and we can't expect an athlete to understand everything from the get-go. So we need to make sure that they can go to people that can point them in the right direction and do that independently from all the other anti-doping organizations.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this sounds like a phenomenal program. And I know, Ben, there's been some really valuable dialogue, particularly in the past few years, and we're starting to see some of these positive changes and new initiatives come out. But for you, having been in this space for some time now, has anything in particular changed, I guess, in terms of how you think about anti-doping or the athlete voice after working with WADA?
Yeah, there's been huge changes. I've been involved in the WADA AC for 9 years, and I remember coming onto the committee and just sort of thinking, what are we actually doing here? And the committee maybe was lacking direction. It was more of a committee where WADA would come to us and say, this is what we're doing in this space. What do you think of this? And I think over the years, that's changed dramatically. It's changed to the point where we now have working groups of our own. We now have projects that we're working of our own. We now have these initiatives that we're really pushing for. We're at the point where in the last code review, I was able to be on that code review because of where the athlete committee standing was within WADA. And so I think we're a lot more future focused as well. We're much more part of the process than we were. And also what happened with Russia as well, that had an enormous impact on the athlete committee and WADA and anti-doping as well. The positions that we took, why we held those positions, I think that, has also really sort of formed the WADA Athlete Committee into the committee that it is now, and that the fact that we need to stand up for integrity, we need to stand up for athletes, and we need to try and make improvements in the system. And out of many, many things have changed in anti-doping as a result of the doping in Russia. But one of the things from my perspective would be athlete rights has become much more of an issue. So we now have the Athletes Anti-Doping Rights Act. In anti-doping sense, outlines the main rights that athletes have. The second part of the document also outlines a number of aspirational rights that we think that anti-doping organisations should be building in to their organisation. So making sure that athletes are aware of those rights, how they can access them, but also where they can go for remedy. And I think this is where the next piece of the puzzle sort of fits in with the ombudsman. So it's all very well to have rights, but you need to be able to access them and you need to be able to work your way through them. And also, if your rights aren't being respected or you have concerns that they're not being respected, you need somewhere to go to be able to sort of help you along that path to get a remedy. And I think the ombuds will be key in that role, because I think any sort of legal system, there has to be a balance. And I don't know if we always strike that balance right in anti-doping. And I think making sure that athlete rights are well looked after and that athletes know those rights will help balance the system a bit more and make sure that athletes, have not just those rights, but a voice within that system.
Certainly. And Ben, you mentioned these new initiatives. You also previously spoke about your hope for representation on the executive committee at WADA, the foundation. I guess, are there other things that you would really like to see WADA do differently going forward?
There's a number of things I'd like to see WADA do slightly differently. I'd really like to see us change athlete representation within WADA in a way that really steps forward. My personal views are I think there needs to be more independence around the executive committee. We have a model, I think, of governance within WADA that is there for a reason, and it's been set up because of the way that WADA works and the way that WADA was founded between the Olympic movement and the governments of the world. But independent athlete representation hasn't been a key part of that, and I think it needs to be a key part of that moving forward. And the other part of that is the anti-doping world has grown enormously, and to make anti-doping effective, you need all these other organisations. And so we've been encouraging countries to establish their own national anti-doping organisations like USADA. But at the same time, we haven't within WADA opened up space for them to be involved in the governance of the organisation. So you have a number of stakeholders now that don't have a say in the organisation which runs anti-doping internationally. And I think we need to find ways to be inclusive and to make sure that every stakeholder group has an effective way to be involved in the international governance of anti-doping. And there's another governance working group working away at the moment within WADA, and I'm looking forward to see their recommendations around this later in the year. But I think we need to continue to change and continue to recognise what the historic structure of anti-doping in WADA is, but also find ways to be more inclusive moving forward. So WADA has a new strategic plan, and within that strategic plan, it talks about the organisation being athlete-centred. And I think that's great to have that on paper, but we really need to bring that to life and make sure that the organisation is athlete-centred. And I think part of that falls on us as the WADA Athlete Committee, having that dialogue with management and the Executive Committee and Foundation Board about how we can bring that to life and really make sure that athletes are part and parcel of every process and every decision-making process that is happening. And the more we can embed athlete representation and athlete voice into the organisation, I think the better that we will be. And there's not one athlete voice. There's a huge amount of diversity in what athletes want, and I think that's a really good thing. And I also think that good decision-making comes from having those diverse opinions. So we need to incorporate that into the WADA Athlete Committee. We need to put that into the rest of the organisation. And I'd like to see WADA be very supportive of the projects that athletes want and that athletes believe would make anti-doping better. So the anti-doping ombudsman is one of the key things there. Like, I think this will be hugely beneficial for athletes internationally, and hopefully it gets the support from WADA that it deserves. But going forward, there will be other projects, and it's about making sure that we listen to athletes and act on those to make sure that we're walking the walk.
Absolutely. And I know, Ben, throughout our conversation, we've really been emphasizing your experience, your history as an athlete, and how that sort of shapes how you approach the work that you do. But you're also an attorney, and I think we can't ignore this. So the legal aspects of anti-doping are a huge and complicated component. So for you, how does your work with WADA inform or complement your legal practice, or perhaps vice versa?
It probably only really works one way. Like, I don't think my work with WADA or the work that I've done in athlete representation or sport necessarily feeds into the lawyer work that I do in practice. But I think it does work the other way around. And so the work I do as a lawyer definitely feeds into the work I do within the athlete committee and WADA. And so maybe that's a reason why I'm a big believer in fairness and athlete rights, because those rights are anyway like a key legal, concept. If you want to have a good working legal system, you need parties to have rights within that system. I remember when I very first got involved in athlete representation, and I was skeleton athlete rep, and there was this one rule that we really wanted to change. And I did all this work. I proposed the rule, and then one of the members of the executive committee came up to me and he said, Ben, this is all very well, but you're not a lawyer, so you don't really understand the complexities of this.
Well, actually.
And I said, actually, I am a lawyer and I do understand the complexities of this, so please have a look at this. And unfortunately, that completely changed the dialogue. Like, as soon as he realized that I was a lawyer, he was a lawyer, I was a lawyer, suddenly he respected my piece of work, and the changes went through, no problem. And they were effective, and they still work to this day. But it's really unfortunate that he needed to know that I had a legal background for him to have any faith in the rules that I proposed. So having a legal background has definitely been an enormous help for me within anti-doping, like whether it's approaching the rules or working through drafting of rules or being involved in the code review process, putting the Athletes' Right Act together. A lot of the work in anti-doping is about creating rules or creating legal processes or processes where you want parties to have equity or say or representation. And so by being a lawyer, I'm not worried about working through all those rules and concepts. And so my legal background and the work that I do as a lawyer definitely has helped me contribute to the athlete representative work that I've done.
Definitely. And Ben, we've talked about just a lot of the issues that we're all kind of still working through in anti-doping, and specifically related to the athlete voice and representation. But I guess if we took away all of the barriers, all the things that are holding you back right now, Ben, Is there one specific problem in anti-doping, whether it's related to the topics we've covered today or kind of anti-doping more general, that you would want to solve most with these unlimited resources and total lack of barriers?
I think one of the things I've learned since being in anti-doping is there's an enormous amount of fantastic people that work in anti-doping and an enormous amount of thought that has gone into developing the rules and to getting us to where we are today. And one of the common things, especially when I first got into the space, like athletes want clean sport. So they would come to me and they'd say, Ben, we 100% support an athlete being banned for 4 years for life if they're caught doping. And that's very easy for us as athletes to say that. But then once you start to dive down into everything, it gets a lot more complicated. So what if that athlete was taking a supplement and the supplement was contaminated? Well, then you don't want them to be banned for life. You probably don't want them to be banned for 4 years because they had no intention of doping. What if it was a contamination issue? So you get all these nuances and all these sort of complicating factors around anti-doping. And it's incredibly hard to create fair rules across the board. And I think the work that anti-doping has done so far has been incredible, but we need to continue to improve. So if I had a magic wand and there was one thing at the moment that I could fix, it would be the whole sort of contamination or inadvertent doping issue. This has been a constant since I would imagine WADA has been around, and it's been a constant thing that athletes come to me with, like, how do we prove the difference between someone that's intentionally doping and someone that's eaten something, taking medication, or ordered a supplement and that supplement's contaminated, and then they return a positive test and suddenly they're facing life-altering and career-ending consequences. So you see sort of the fear in athletes' faces when they talk about this, and I know as an athlete, it was something that I was incredibly concerned about. And I took supplements. They were part of how I trained and how I competed. But there's that inherent risk in there. And as our testing has become even more and more sensitive in recent years, we now are seeing positive tests returned for athletes who are, whether it's, food contamination or medication that's contaminated. And with the system that we have, we're then asking the athletes to then prove their innocence. And you can imagine if your sample's retested after 4 years or 8 years and it comes back with a minute trace of banned substance, you're not going to be able to recall what you ate 4 years ago.
Right.
One thing that we sometimes advise athletes to do is if you're taking supplements to leave a little bit of that supplement in the container. So if you do get caught, you can go back and get it tested, but you're not going to keep every single protein powder from 4 years ago that you've been taking. And so if I could wave a magic wand, it would be around sorting this out. That would be my wish. But in reality, I don't think there's a magic answer to this. And I think it's something that WADA and anti-doping is dealing with on a number of different levels. Yeah, and I really encourage this work to continue because I don't think we've got anywhere near close where the system in this sense works perfectly. We need to continue to try and improve it, but whether it's around increasing athletes' rights to, access to legal aid, access to justice to make sure that athletes know what they're being charged with, know how they can defend themselves, that we're not making that process too expensive or complicated for athletes, but also the introduction of thresholds for common contaminants because our testing has become so sensitive. So having those thresholds, having a system which is reasonably adaptive. So as we see common contaminants coming along, we can add them to that list to make sure that we aren't catching athletes that, are just unfortunate and just really unlucky because the food that they've eaten or the medication that they've taken is contaminated.
Certainly. Well, Ben, I'm so glad you brought up these issues today. And I know we've covered quite a bit of ground. So if our listeners out there would like to learn more about any of the topics we talked about or more about WADA in general, where can they go or what should they do?
If you want to contact me directly, I'm more than happy to be contacted. My email is sandford.ben@gmail.com. You can also reach out to us through the WADA website. There's a huge amount of resources on the WADA website and a number of things I've spoken about you can find within the education resources that WADA has online. Contact your anti-doping organisation. Contact us if you want to and you need to. If you have concerns about anything, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear your voice and your opinion. I'm all about trying to make things better and improve things, particularly for athletes. But I think if we improve things for athletes, we'll also improve things for anti-doping and WADA in general. So just wanting to try and continue on this work, and please contact me if you want to.
Oh, phenomenal. Well, listeners, definitely get connected. Check out those resources on the WADA website. And Ben, we really appreciate you joining us today for the interview and for sharing all of these insights with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's been wonderful to chat with you, listeners. Great to have you here as well. If you haven't had a chance yet, listeners, we'd appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to share your experience with the show. And we hope you'll join us for our next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.